Good morning, everyone. My name's Angel Cortez. I'm a project officer at the SlowCat Partnership for Sustainable Low Carbon Transport. And thanks so much for coming to this session here, hosted by UN Habitat, the International Association of Public Transport, also known as UITP, and the World Bank. And so, thank you again for joining us today as we address the critical role of urban transport in combating climate change and achieving sustainable development goals. Today, only 60% of the world's urban population actually has convenient access to public transport, leaving us with a very significant gap in our ability to meet SDGs 11.2.1 and our climate goals. And as cities expand and transport demand rises, we face a pivotal opportunity to simultaneously tackle climate change and improve quality of life. Investing in multimodal transport systems, ones that include public transit, walking, cycling, and ride sharing, offers a unique chance to reduce emissions while also enhancing public health, safety, and inclusivity. The integration of these modes, backed by ambitious NDCs, can transform urban mobility into driving forces for climate action and equitable development. Specifically, our discussion here today will dive into the pressing need to better connect land use and transport planning while accelerating the implementation of these multimodal transport systems. And we will explore this topic in more detail through an insightful panel discussion where our expert speakers, who I'll invite shortly to the stage, will share their experiences and insights on unlocking the potential of sustainable urban transport. Also dive into the challenges and opportunities related to multimodal transport systems, governance, and how we can align ambition with practical, measurable action. So I'll go ahead and welcome our distinguished panelists to the stage. First, we have Ms. Frozo Christofides, the Director of Member Networks of the Willis Federation. Next, we have Mr. Philip Turner, the Head of Sustainable Development at the International Association of Public Transport. And then we have Mr. Nicolas Peltier-Theberg, the Global Director of Transport Sector and Infrastructure Practice Group of the World Bank. Great. And last but certainly not least, we have Ms. Ju Hyun Ha, Senior Advisor on Sustainability Strategy and International Partnerships of the International Union of Railways. And at some point, we may have a special guest also join us. I hope we do, but in the event, we move forward with our program and the panel discussion that we have. So this discussion will unfold in 2 rounds of questions. The first one will explore the challenges and successful approaches on building inclusive multimodal transport systems. And then we'll jump into a second round as well, focusing on enhancing NDC ambition, leveraging data, and financing for sustainable urban mobility. And then we'll have an opportunity to open up the floor to any questions and answers after each round of questions. So we'll start off the first round of questions. Frozo, how can cities prioritize equity and inclusivity within multimodal transport planning, ensuring that all residents benefit from access to a diversity of mobility options?
For that question. Can you all hear me properly? Yeah, thank you. I have identified this microphone as the problematic one earlier today, so let me know if it stops working. So my name is Frozo Christofides. I'm the Director of Members and Networks at the European Cyclist Federation, and I also represent at this year's COP the Partnership for Active Travel and Health. That is a coalition funded by the FIA Foundation with Walk21, ECF, and UNEP that we collectively call on national governments and cities to prioritize walking and cycling as solutions for climate, health, and the equity challenges we face today. So in doing so, and part of our advocacy work, both as the European Cyclist Federation and PATH, we talk about the hierarchy of mobility options. And we always invite cities and national governments to prioritize walking and cycling as the basis of the inverted pyramid of mobility, followed by public transport and shared transport, and only then do we talk about private motorized transport. Of course, in order to prioritize equity and inclusivity, cities prioritizing walking and cycling as fully fledged modes of transport is super important, but also the integration with public transport is vital. And in doing so, cities have the potential and national governments have the potential to cut transport emissions in half by 2030. So what that looks like in practice is so prioritization should be translated not only in planning but also policy making and funding allocations for concrete actions. Actions that have to do with infrastructure, so developing and improving on the walking and cycling infrastructure for better, easier and more affordable mobility choices. Of course, the integration with public transport so that we underpin longer journeys and the sustainability of them. Land use planning to ensure quality access to key services such as public transport hubs, retail, schools, and then as complementary measures, capacity building and campaigns to shift people's mobility choices. So overall, I think cities can prioritize equity and inclusivity with political will. We see it needs a very conscious effort to make cities equitable and inclusive environments. Walking and cycling are very important in that regard, and reallocating space away from private motorized transport goes a long way. So I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Frozo. Yeah, I think we'll get to dive deeper into kind of the comprehensive approaches that go hand in hand with addressing public transport as a major key to achieving these goals that we have. And building on what Frozo has just said and transitioning into the public transport, Philip, how well is public transport reflected in NDCs, and what more needs to be done to scale up access to public transport?
Okay, thank you very much. I think NDCs are brilliant, personally. I know they've got their kind of criticisms, but I think they're really useful tools because, I mean, essentially they're a political commitment in a way, and telling the world what a national government is going to do. I think they're very useful tools at the same time in the fact that it enables those different levels of government to actually have that conversation about what needs to be done. And that means kind of engaging cities and local level players. I used to work in the ministry in a certain country. I guess you won't be able to tell which one. We never talked to our cities. So, but NDCs kind of enable that. And also the other thing is that it's across sectors. So I think that enables that conversation to happen. So I think you have to look at NDCs in a kind of different light and what they can do. I mean, there's some good news and some bad news. The good news is that 2/3 of countries include public transport interventions. Obviously, you've got a gap there. So if you need to make them more ambitious, which they have to do by February, you just include more public transport interventions because it is a real climate solution and an underrated one. Emissions can be cut by half very, very quickly. It can really change how cities are managed and planned, the modal shift aspect, but also it makes streets far more efficient, makes it just reduces congestion. So the climate benefits are quite significant. And when you look at the interventions of who's doing what, there is kind of like a very stark difference between the global north and the global south. So the global north looks at electrification of public transport. The global south is very much focused on infrastructure development and service and increasing of services. And I think that's important because when you look at the SDG 11.2, it's these kind of, the global south does not have convenient access to public transport. Only 30% of urban populations do. So I think that there's quite a significant opportunity around that and also linking the two agendas. And I had to go through 196 NDCs to look at which country's doing what. Trust me, that was a labour of love, I can tell you that. But very rarely do they identify a specific government ministry to deliver the public transport intervention. When they do, they obviously would pick the Ministry of Transport, but very often at the national level, they actually don't have public transport in their portfolio. It's very much delivered at the local level. So this is why I think this whole issue of having that conversation between the different levels of government is so important. And when you look at when these public transport projects are going to be delivered, very rarely do they make very long-term commitments, say up to 2050. But I think that's really critical to do, because that provides confidence to operators, businesses, so on and so forth, about where the investments are going to be made. And so if you are going to be strengthening your NDCs in 2025, I think that's a real critical issue as well. The other thing is, very rarely do countries set targets. Only 20% of NDCs do, and they only really focus on electric buses. Very rarely do they look at a modal shift element, and that's where the kind of greatest benefits you can get from a climate point of view. The investment side of it, only a third actually indicate a budget, and in most cases, because it's the Global South, it's conditional on having climate finance, but also capacity building and technical skills. UITP as an organisation, we do a huge amount of capacity building, technical assistance. We don't have the money because we're a not-for-profit, but I think it's really important to put that kind of financial message out there, because that shows you the kind of gap that you have to fill in. I think the last bit is you need to obviously link these targets to KPIs and make that link to the wider sustainability agenda, because at the end of the day, public transport improves people's quality of life, and that's what you really have to measure, and ensuring that information is fed up to the national government is so critically important. And I think that's where really the opportunities are, but also where the gaps are that need to be filled.
Thanks so much, Philip, on that dive. Before we move on, the rest of our panel, I'd actually love to another one of our panelists on the stage, Mr. Manuel Acoleta Lopez de Araujo, the mayor of Pelamani in Mozambique, who's joined us on the stage. And we're very glad to have you here. To continue on this train of thought on NDCs, and of course we're at a very critical and pivotal time at the moment, because as many of you know, the next generation of NDCs are due for submission in February. I wanted to ask this question to Ju. You know, UIC has also been developing an NDC template for the rail sector, which is a large missing piece of this multimodal transport system. So how are cities highlighted in this work, and can you share an example?
Very faint and okay, I can hear myself. It's very odd. Hi, my name is Ju. I work at the International Union of Railways as the head of advocacy, and I wanted to share the work DC template. Last year, we developed an analysis together with Path Coalition, with UITP, looking into how rail has been portrayed in the NDCs that had been released so far. And we do know of the environmental benefit that rail can propose. Right now, we carry 7% of the passengers globally and 8% of freight, but only emit 1.2% of emissions. So it's a big opportunity for countries to invest more in rail, ensure that there is that connectivity for people and goods, but not burden the environment further by doing so. And so we did this analysis of the NDCs that were out there until last year, and we saw that only 25% of the NDCs had mentions of rail at any capacity. And to our alarm, even less so, about 10% of NDCs have specific targets for rail. And so thinking about that and thinking about this opportunity, the new generation of NDCs that are coming, that mentioned, we joined the efforts with UITP and with Path Coalition in also developing a template for the rail sector. And you can find all of them here in the QR codes. We can circulate this later so that you can grab a photo and read the whole material. But essentially, for the rail NDC template, we looked into providing more guidance on recommendations in 6 areas around the objectives, the ambition, the action. So how can countries improve? What kind of actions do they have to invest on? So say looking into both mitigation and adaptation, making sure that they're covering both passenger and freight rail transport, but looking into not only electrification, which was a big piece of the NDCs that we had seen so far, but also into the opportunities related to network development, so growing their rail network. And then finally, which is a very important piece, modal shift. So the countries that already have rail transport, then how can we get people from more higher emitting modes into lower emitting modes like rail, and what kind of policies can support that modal shift? We also looked into recommendations around collaboration, evaluation, and financing. But since the question is around cities and we are at the at the SDG Pavilion, I wanted to talk about how cities are portrayed, how cities connect to rail in this NDC template. And myself, I used to work for the São Paulo city government for the International Relations Department, where I was responsible for covering topics around environment, urban development, and transport. And so I understand, I'm very passionate about cities. I think cities play a very important role in climate action, and they can show great leadership. So much so that in São Paulo, it was very much the case that oftentimes the city would lead some actions and then it would be taken up by the national government. So that was the case for setting up the municipal committee on planning for climate change as an inter-department task force. That was also the case for the municipal plan for solid waste management. That was also that was the inspiration for the national plan. And so I think it's really important that in the context of these NDCs that the countries recognize the collaboration with cities, right? Like how can these national governments support cities in the great climate action that they're doing? And in that sense, I wanted to bring you the example of the Nigeria's NDC, which highlights the importance of working closely with their states and local governments in coordinating action for climate change. And they give the example of the Lagos 5-year climate action plan, which envisages action in several areas, including spatial planning for TOD, which is super important for walking and cycling, as Firza was mentioning, but also a modal shift to rail within transport. So yeah, that's the type of action that we really would like to see in NDCs. And it might look small, but I think it's really important for cities that are trying to do more and more action for climate change to have that sort of recognition from their national governments, especially in international climate policies like the NDCs. But that's it from my.
Thanks a lot, Drew, for that dive into this concrete example on the scale. And to is it okay? To ask Mr. Manuel Acoyete Lopez de Araujo, the mayor of Quelimane, this question on what are the key challenges that your city faces in implementing a truly effective multimodal transport system? Specifically, how do these obstacles impact progress, and what strategies could address them to unlock the full potential in integrated mobility networks?
Well, thank you very much for having me. And I really want to Apologize for arriving a bit late. Transport system is not quite. Well, first of all, I define a city as the place where people and goods move from point A and to point B in an acceptable way. Because from the time you cannot move people or you cannot move goods from point A to point B at the time which is acceptable, then to me, it's no longer a city. We can call any other name, but it is not fulfilling its main function, which is to make the lives of people and the business strive. So in my city, and I think that I'm not only speaking to Kilimani City, where I am the mayor, but I think that I'm also speaking for the case of the Global South cities. One of the biggest challenges that we city managers and also the citizens of the Global South cities is the lack of qualified people to understand the challenges. So this brings, if we want to link the obstacle, the difficulties to the way out, which are the strategies, this will then lead us to the payment need for capacity building in those cities. Because most of the states in the Global South, they are very centralized. And there is this migration from the cities, or the secondary cities, because I'm also speaking from the secondary city perspective. Is it better? I hope. Okay. So I'm also speaking, as I was saying, from the secondary cities perspective. There is this natural migration from intermediary or secondary cities to the main cities. And this migration takes the most qualified, trained people to the capitals or to the main cities. So the issue of capacity building, to me, is of a paramount importance if we want to achieve the objectives that we do want. The second challenge that we face is to do, of course, with not only with human resources, but with financial resources. Even if you do have the qualified people, it's very challenging for you to, first of all, because of the asymmetric nature of information distribution in the Global South, then it's very hard for you, even if you have the qualified people, to identify the places where resources are. I'm talking, of course, first of all, human resources, but secondly, but not least important, the issue of finances. So there is a lot of money available, but these resources, these financial resources are not equally distributed. And cities in the Global South, and indeed intermediary or secondary cities, do not have access to that information, first of all. And if you link this asymmetric distribution of information with lack of capacity to access those funds, then you can imagine the amount of difficulty that you do face. The third challenge that we face, but this is very specific for the case of Kilimani City, when I became mayor for the first time in 2011, was the, how do I put it in a more diplomatic way, was that those using, or those, for example, cycling, were seen as a third-class citizen. So there was a kind of a stigma towards those who were either walking or cycling. So, I mean, if you wanted or if you perceive walking and cycling as the mean of transport in a given area, then you need to go beyond this kind of sentiment that the society have got, that roads were made for cars, roads were not made for cycling or for walking. Therefore, those who use walking or cycling are seen as not as equal citizens as those who have got cars. For example, when I trying to unleash the first cycle line in my city, I was presented with a barrier of protest from car owners. Okay, They even wrote letters to the public attorney saying that the fact that I was diminishing the space available for cars was something that the national government should not allow, should interfere. And actually, they even went to the courts to launch an action against a more equitable distribution of the mode of transport. I went to that action because I discovered that we had more bicycles per capita in my city than any other mode of transport. And therefore, it was important to democratize the roads. And one of the ways of democratizing the roads was to divide the space available for walking, for cycling, but also for cars in a proportional way. But of course, I faced a fierce fight against the car owners. But of course, we had to go against it, and we went to court. Eventually, we won. Because why? Because we had data. Okay? I was able of presenting the data saying, look, we have got this amount of people in our city. And like about 20 to 30%, they were walking. About 30 to 34%, they were cycling. And car were the minority. So why do we have more space for those who are in the minority than those who have? So I had to make that case. Of course, I also went to ask people to sign, to make a petition, because they had submitted a petition. They can't owners because they have more resources and so on, but they submitted a petition in a court case. So I used the same strategy. I went to those walking and cycling, and we made a petition. And actually, we outbeat those who had cars, of course, because we are the majority. So we were able of imposing our will to have more cycling and walking space, to the extent that in these years, one of the edition of The Economist in April, they presented Kilimani City as the most walkable city in the world. Of course, this for us, it was a win. It was something that showed that the world is looking, the small battles that we are confronting and we are facing in those secondary or tertiary cities. So what are the strategies? The first lesson I learned from this is like we need leadership. Okay? You may have very good public policy. If those at the leadership position don't take the action themselves, then it's very unlikely that we will make progress. And I'm known in my city and in most African cities as the cycling mayor. Why? Because I do cycle from home to office and from office to home. And like by guiding by example, I managed to change the image that cycling had in my city to a more positive. Well, because the mayor cycles, like for example, I use in all my campaigns for re-election, I don't use car, I use bicycle. So like what I preach, I make it. And I lead by example. And by doing that, I managed to change the perception about cycling in my city. And therefore today it's a fashion. Not only in my city, but in other cities in Mozambique. One of the biggest achievements that we reached was when the transport councillor at Maputo City, they decided to go and for a more walkable and cycling strategy and means of transport. I mean, Maputo has got about 3 million citizens, while in my city we have only 500,000. So like convincing the capital of my country that our way was the best way. And of course, we need to take into account also one factor which is very relevant to the global south, which is the issue of patch alliance. Like, you know, I'm from the opposition. So like having a mayor and a councillor from the capital city who doesn't belong to my party, who is part of the ruling party, to follow an example from a secondary city, for a third city, and from a party which is not aligned with them, to me and for Mozambique, it was, to my city, it was a big achievement. So like, if we lead by example, others may follow suit, and it's more easier to convince not only public opinion, but also those in higher positions to follow the example that we are having. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mayor Araujo. And I think your insights have really highlighted that beyond the elements that are associated with these challenges, one of them is really behavioral shifts that are needed, because we have so much important work and so much collaboration going to strategizing and developing these really comprehensive approaches, but at the same time you can take them to the higher level of implementation, but you really still need to convince people to also be a part of that change. And though we may dive into that aspect later on, I want to circle back to the point of the challenge of finance. And luckily we have Nicola from World Bank sitting on our panel today. And so, Nicola, how is the World Bank innovating in its support to urban transport projects?
Thank you. So, multilateral development banks like, can you hear me? Yeah. Like the World Bank finance projects in all transport modes, no? But urban transport is a special case that we see growing very fast at the moment. Just to give you a sense, 10 years ago we had one BRT project in Africa in our portfolio. Now we have 17, and we keep receiving a lot of demand. We finance BRTs, we finance metros, we finance urban rail. And the reason for that are very clear. No? The words keep urbanizing. Actually, on the African continent, that urbanization is accelerating. So this creates all sorts of negative externalities, congestion, and so it's quite natural that cities are turning, are looking at mass transit systems to make urban transport more convenient and more sustainable. Now, a second reason why that demand keeps increasing is air quality. And I was last week in Pakistan, in Punjab, in the city of Lahore, which right now is facing a peak of air pollution that is really dramatic. It reduces the life expectancy of the population of Lahore by more than 4 years. So a very, very serious problem. And that's another entry point, for urban clean urban transport. I can mention one example that I think is a bit of a flagship operation that we have now on the African continent, which is the Dakar BRT, which entered into operation earlier this year. It's a fantastic project, and actually the entry point was both congestion and air quality, because Dakar is also a very polluted city. So that project now is complete. It's the first BRT on the African continent running with electric buses, and on top of that, those buses are powered by renewable energy. So it's really a fully integrated solution. It gives mobility services to 300,000 commuters daily. It will reduce greenhouse gas emission by over 1 million ton over its lifetime. Which is the equivalent of taking 260,000 cars off the road. And finally, another innovation in that project is that it was structured as a PPP, so bringing both the public and the private sector together. And we had to bring all the various entities of the World Bank, so also IFC and MIGA, and this helped to mobilize $144 million of private capital. So I like to mention that example because it kind of ticks all the boxes of what we want to do. And on top of that, there are some bike lanes that are connecting to the BRT stations. We want to replicate that. We want to go to scale. Abidjan will be the next one in Côte d'Ivoire. The tendering is ongoing. Lots of momentum on the electrification of buses, e-buses. In India, we're working with the government on this plan that they call the Grand Challenge, which is a beautiful innovation. One of the challenges of going to scale for e-buses is that the cost can be high if you procure in small batches. But what India did is they pooled the demand from their cities and states, and then they were able to procure in bulk. The intention is 50,000 buses, and by doing that, you generate economies of scale that can put e-buses on par or even below diesel buses. No? So these are some of the powerful innovation. I was in a panel yesterday where we heard that now other countries are copying the example of India, like Vietnam. So these innovations are spreading quite quickly. We are working on more than 40 countries right now on e-mobility, e-buses and E2 and 3-wheelers. Brazil is another example that comes to mind. The city of Sao Paulo intends to electrify their entire fleet. This is the largest fleet of buses in Latin America, 16,000 buses. So that's going to be another game changer. And now let me come to active mobility, because there were a lot of references about the biking and cycling agenda, and that's really another very powerful tool to make urban mobility more sustainable, but also it's an opportunity to transform cities. And what is interesting is when you have mayors like the mayors of Kilimati, you see that it's beyond just building a few kilometers of bike lane. No, it's a radical way to transform a city, to make it more livable. COVID has been an accelerator of active mobility. Many people switch to walking and biking. It stayed after COVID. I mean, we have some evidence that this was not a blip, but people really changed their mobility behaviors. So now we're working with a number of cities in Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, Peru, Senegal, and Tanzania on building bike lanes. We released last year at the COP a report on the economics of e-mobility that shows that the case is very strong. There is no question about that. And during this COP, actually yesterday, we're going to tomorrow we are going to release a new model to standardize the economic evaluation of active mobility. And I hope that will help mayors to provide the data, the evidence that this makes sense. So let me just finish by saying that these are the building blocks for a more sustainable mobility, and they are bundling benefits. So if you combine urban public transport with electric buses, with bike lanes that can feed and increase the ridership of public transport, that's where you get the biggest benefit, and that's what we need to bring to scale.
Thank you so much, Nicola. And I think one of the best things that's reiterated in your example is being able to see exactly where the financial institutions are able to reinforce the past commitments coming from previous COPs on pouring this money into Global South and making sure that we invest in those infrastructure needs that we've been highlighting over the past years. And speaking of finance, this question that I have is rolling up for Drew. And we're here at COP29, and finance has been a very big word that we're hearing as the finance COP. And so we've heard a lot through the past couple of panelists about the different other modes that are associated with multimodal transport, but can you kind of talk to us about what kind of opportunities you see for the rail sector, and how do they fit the context of NDCs?
Hello. Yes. Yes, I think so. As part of, as I was mentioning earlier, our Rail NDC template has different recommendations, and one of them is on financing, and that is really looking through the opportunity that exists in these NDCs for international collaboration to finance some of this ambition that is presented on the NDC on countries' NDCs. Obviously, we understand that low and middle income countries will need this international support to be able to deliver on this enhance the mission and help us get to the 1.5 degree scenario. And we understand also that rail development is a costly investment, is a big, it requires a big upfront cost to be covered. And we also understand that this sort of investments, they cannot come at the cost of financial health of these cities and countries, right? So we don't want them to be further in debt because of such projects. And so one of the things that we looked into last year, we had a study developed on climate finance instruments that can support low and low middle income countries in investing in rail as a way to decouple economic development from transport emissions. So and one of the tools that we identified there was the opportunity with carbon credit markets. So under the Paris Agreement in Article 6.2 and 6.4 more specifically, it is presented the new mechanism of the Internationally Transferred Mitigation Outcome, so the ITMO. And for the ones who know, that's an upgrade from the CDM, the Clean Development Mechanism that was developed for the protocol, the Kyoto Protocol. And so we started looking into that as an opportunity for rail companies to be able to attain these carbon credits through the avoided emissions that come from the modal shift, right? So if you are in a car, but then you start using a public transport, say bus, bikes, trains, you are reducing the amount of emissions that are going into the that are being emitted, and why not benefit from that? So under these NDCs, countries can present their conditional and unconditional targets. So unconditionals, they mean that they already have identified sources of funding, so they will deliver on that ambition. But for the conditional ones, countries are saying, okay, so if we are granted this sort of investment, then we can take our ambition further and increase the amount of emissions that we can reduce. And so, so it is really important for countries to also present their projects that can help them enhance ambition and benefit from that international cooperation to deliver them. And this is extremely important for sectors like rail that require that are costly. So to be able to benefit from those from the revenue of these carbon credits that would come without interest or without generating more debt. So yeah, as part of our recommendations, we do highlight that opportunity, and we want to make sure that countries know about that. Well, obviously they know about that, but they also extend that to the rail sector.
Thanks a lot, Ju. And I think we're circling back a little bit, but speaking on being able to be aware of the resources, we all understand the power of data, and I'll throw the question back to Nicola. What is needed to impactfully measure urban transport accessibility, and how can cities and countries have the capacity to track and monitor it on a regular basis, and how do we make sure that these resources are known to those who need it?
So I think we need to invest a little bit more in transport data. Transport is a complex sector, so it has different modes, and there are many indicators. But we need a couple of high-level indicators that can allow us to shape a narrative. And I think an access indicator has been a little bit missing for the transport sector. Although I want to give a shout out to our UN Habitat and UITP colleagues, because they invested a lot in tracking SDG indicator 11.2.1, which is the number of people who have access to public transportation, and in cities that's a very relevant one. In rural areas, We have the rural accessibility indicator, which measures the number of people having access to a climate resilient road. I mean, that's very basic infrastructure, but it can be really critical in rural areas. So we have those indicators that are both on the mitigation and on the adaptation side. Now I think we need to combine them, because when we do that, you realize that you have half of the world's population that today doesn't have access to sustainable transport. So coming back a little bit to the urban accessibility indicator, it's a very powerful one. I think it measures it distinguishes whether you have access to a high capacity or a low capacity public transportation. If we customize it a little bit, we can introduce bike lanes also, because that's a way also to increase ridership by increasing your catchment area. When you can get to a metro or a BRT station faster because using your bike, and then you have parking facilities. That's also another way to improve your mobility system at the city level. So at the World Bank, we've recently updated our corporate scorecards. It used to have 150 indicators. And our new president, when he came, he said, "Oh, well, that's way too much. I cannot tell a story with 150 indicators. I just need a few ones, but I need those ones to be good ones and people-centric." And so we came down to 22 indicators. We introduced this access to sustainable transport indicators as part of these 22 indicators. And now we started to track it. And it's very powerful, because then you can aggregate what you... all of your financing and track how you're contributing to filling the gap. And now we are talking to other development institutions, other NDBs. I mean, could we partner and use that same indicator so that we can collectively see how we are moving the needle?
Yeah. It makes a lot of sense. And in the interest of time, we'll speed up the panel just a little bit. But as someone who has been spearheading this work with the indicators, Philip, you spoke a little bit on the challenges earlier of including public transport in the NDCs. What targeted interventions are essential to overcome these challenges, and what role can the NDCs play?
Well, I think it's very easy to update NDCs and to make them more ambitious. You simply include what's happening in your cities because they're taking the lead. So that's the easiest way to do it. I think the other thing to remember is not all the policy levers are actually at the local level. There was a study by LSE Cities which said that 20% of policy levers on transport in cities is actually dictated by national governments. So that could be regulations, economic policies, information and awareness, governance reforms. So governments can really support cities, or they can make a problem for their cities. So I think that's kind of really important to remember. So what we did is we engaged public transport authorities, operators, businesses, but also city networks like ICLAIM, the C40, saying, what would you need to be included in an NDC in order to make your life easier? And it was pretty simple. And there was complete consensus off the board. Firstly, you need to set that vision and have public transport and active mobility as the backbone of urban mobility. That has to be clearly labelled in your NDC and have that as a national government policy. NDCs don't include that. I think so having that vision, clearly articulating targets as well. And I think it's important to reflect what was agreed at last year at COP28, when it talked about reducing emissions across a range of pathways through infrastructure investments and zero and low emission vehicles. So you should be reflecting these kind of targets like mode shift, electrification, etc. in your NDCs, and link that back up to your national level target of overall emission reductions. So you see the transport sector's contribution to that. The actions that can be taken, we only really identified 14 of the really key policies that should be changed, and around 3 objectives around supporting changes in mobility habits. We heard about the importance of leadership and how that can really drive the agenda, and it's doing that. And there are many things that governments are doing in their NDCs, doing things like car-free days. That sends a really strong kind of important message. So they do that in South Africa, and highlighting the importance of public transport. Transport demand management programs. Bahamas has a huge amount in their NDC. So countries are doing these things and articulating them. They're just not putting them all together. Investing in cities, we've heard about the importance of that. National governments can provide direct investment. Canada in their NDC earmarks $3 billion Canadian dollars for public transport investments from 2026 to 27 annually. They can also support cities through land value capture. In Bangladesh, they do that. Pricing schemes as well. Fossil fuel subsidies, removals, and investing in public transport networks. Indonesia does that. So countries do it. Designing cities around people, not cars. We heard about that. Urban planning regulations, linking that with the climate agenda. Mexico has outlined that in their NDCs. The importance of enabling cities. We heard about capacity building, governance reforms, having public transport authorities that can do sustainable urban mobility planning. Uruguay has that in their NDCs. So lots of countries do these things. National focal points. I think that's a really important one. And I think also, really, just in the interest of time and dropping my speaking notes, I'll conclude here that I think having those basic elements and having that feedback loop back up to the national government is so critically important. There's a lot that can be done to support cities, and I actually think it's pretty easy and it should be done.
Thanks so much, Philip. And to keep talking about NDCs and also getting the active travel side of this lens, I'd like to pass the question to Frozo. And how can the level of ambition in NDCs and their transport targets be increased for more active modes of travel? And which role can multimodal transport play?
Thank you for that question. And in the interest of time, I wouldn't want to repeat anything that Philip said because obviously we agree with everything. I just want to add that path, similar to UIC and UITP, we did our own NDC analysis of where active mobility is present in the NDCs of all the UNFCCC countries. And we also did an analysis of national walking and cycling policies. And we found that even though 2/3 of the countries have some sort of active mobility policy in place on the national level, only 8 countries make that connection to their NDCs. So in terms of raising ambition across the board for rail, for public transport, and for active mobility, reviewing and elevating those elements from the national and the local level into the NDCs should be really low-hanging fruit for the next reviewing round. I would perhaps maybe leave it there because I assume the session is about to end. So, but if you have any questions, I'm happy to take them afterwards.
Thanks so much, Rosso. And I know, Mayor Araujo, you already gave us examples earlier of how leadership plays into making a vital change. I have another last question for you, where can you please provide examples where governance and planning frameworks have led to measurable success on multimodality, and what key elements contributed to their effectiveness, aside from the role that leadership was playing? So you walk the walk and you have to talk the talk, right?
Indeed. I mean, I could also share some, as you're asking, some examples where we managed to push forward this agenda. And one of the ways we did so was to, first of all, to organize those cyclists and give them a voice. Because, as I said before, those cycling were invisible, though we could see them every day in the streets. There were accidents, there were people going to the clinics and so on, but they didn't have a voice. So what we did as the municipality, we kind of rented out 2 of our lawyers to work with them so that they could come up with the way to legalize an organization that will be the mouthpiece for those cycling. So we organized it, we gave them voice, and they had a seat in our meetings so that they could be part and parcel. So like we brought their voices, which were not heard anywhere, to the center of public policy decision making and implementation. So by working together and by giving them that voice, we were able of listening to their challenges. And one of the biggest challenges was, and the question that we put was, why are not more people cycling in our city? And we carry out a research because, again, the importance of data. And we came up that one of the surveys that we took there gave us a very simple result that women and children were not cycling because we didn't have secure infrastructure in the city. So with that conclusion, we started advocating and we looked around who could then work with us to implement what is now known as the first cycle line in Mozambique, which was in Quelimane City. Eventually, there was a challenge which was launched by the Bloomberg philanthropists, where more than 265 cities around the world compete. And Quelimane, to our surprise, was chosen among the 10 top cities. Fortaleza in Brazil was the first, and they got $1 million, while the other 6 cities got $400,000, including Bogota, Lisbon, Tirana, and so on. So for us, getting that amount of money allow us to build infrastructure, which then answered to one of the challenges that we had, which was lack of resources, lack of human capacity to build infrastructure. And from there, then we were able of opening, because we had something to show. Look, our willingness to do things is there. And when we get money, we deliver. So like we managed with that resources that we first got from the Portuguese Environmental Agency. We built 3 kilometers of cycle line. And from that, we use that as an example of our commitment, and we are selected to get this $400,000. So like now we can build 5 kilometers of cycle line in our city, plus zebra crossing and a traffic light. I mean, imagine a city of more than 6,000 bicycles without a single traffic line. I mean, the number of accidents were like, so we need to link public awareness, public policy, resource. I mean, we have been knocking doors from the banks and other funders, but it's very difficult for them to understand our plea, our needs at the time we need. This year, also funded by the Bloomberg, we traveled to Washington to advocate with the World Bank, IMF, and others so that local government could have direct access to funding. Because one of the biggest challenge that we face in the global south is the inability of cities to access at least secondary and third-tier cities. Because normally World Bank and IMF, they work with governments. And to trickle down and to make that link between city, local institutions, central government and the World Bank, it's a really challenge. So I'm pleading here if a door could be opened so that local government could have access. I mean, I heard that Abidjan. But if you go there, Abidjan is getting this funding because of the national government. So in situations like mine, where I'm from the opposition, and in many cities it do happen, then my priorities are not the central government priorities. Therefore, the ability of my city of accessing funding from the World Bank and IMF and other multilateral institutions is very diminished. So we need to find avenues where cities are not funded by the World Bank according to their color or to their political party alignment. The needs are there. And when, for example, climate change events come, they don't choose, those cities aligned to the ruling party or those cities not aligned. So we need to go beyond that, and we need really to respond to the challenges that are arising from the local cities, secondary, but also tertiary institutions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mayor Araujo. And I wish we had more time, but unfortunately we are at our limit. So thank you to our distinguished panelists for joining us, and to you as well for being at this session. And we'll be around for any other questions in case you want to carry on the conversation. But thank you so much.